I wish I had a dollar for every time, just in the past year, that I've heard a salesperson say, I don't want to seem pushy. I'm hearing it often as I'm out there field coaching sales reps, or as we're doing role play and training sessions, or as I'm coaching sellers who are having difficulty breaking through to advance the sale. And I get it. I've felt it myself. And I know that the desire to not feel pushy is something that we need to address, because that desire to not feel pushy is actually costing us sales. So this webinar, this is for everyone who manages someone who has ever said that they don't want to seem pushy. And it's for every seller who's experienced hesitation or has those times when they're just not feeling it. So you justify not calling because, after all, you rationalize that the prospect or the customer, he or she really is so busy, and they probably don't want to talk to me anyway, you might be telling yourself. So whether you're reluctant to cold call or to follow up, or you manage someone who is, this webinar is for you. And before we start, I just want to take a moment to introduce myself to you. My name is Deb Calvert. I work in sales training and sales coaching. I also work in the leadership space, which is where my current focus, Stop Selling and Start Leading, which is a project based in buyer research. And it's all about behaviors of sellers and how buyers really react, not how we perceive they might be reacting. So I have some very interesting insights from buyers themselves about this notion of whether or not we're really being pushy. And as I mentioned, I do field coaching, and I follow up with sellers who have attended training programs either at UC Berkeley, where I teach a course, or in the workshops that I offer to clients in various sectors all around the U.S. and in a couple of other countries as well. So I tell you all that just to let you know that what I'm sharing with you, it comes from research, but it also comes directly from salespeople and from their sales managers who are reporting on what they do. Now, interestingly, the number one reason, the primary reason for underperformance in selling, according to this study by the BSRP with sellers worldwide, the number one reason is call reluctance. Sellers underperform because they are reluctant to make calls. More often, that's the problem than anything else. And if I'm honest with myself, I have to admit that even I've experienced this at times, despite my very long career in selling and the success that I've had and the confidence that I have as a seller. I've experienced this too, and I bet you have, as a manager, also understood what it's like to be either in a sales slump or to feel like you've lost your mojo. And that can become a very vicious cycle, because that erosion in confidence, that fuels even more call reluctance. It causes you to hold back and to justify your reluctance to call. So this is a big deal, and it's something no seller is immune to, and that's why I felt like it was really, really important that we talk about it. Why is there this call reluctance then? Well, there are reluctances to call because sellers don't want to appear pushy or intrusive. They're reluctant to call, and if we peel that back and ask sellers why, what's holding you back from making those phone calls? Why is it that you aren't jumping on the phone and making more dials? Why is it that you're not following up more often and more timely with your prospects? And this is the answer. I made this anecdotal observation, and I've been paying attention to it for months now. So I was very happy to see that there was actually formal research that also says the very same thing. I was delighted to find out that my in-field experiences were backed by this particular research with sellers in 10 countries, nearly 200,000 of them. But you've seen it too. Your own research or reflection would probably say that this is familiar. This resonates because it's what salespeople say, and I hear it all the time. When I talk to sales managers, they tend to think that it's more the newcomers, the millennials, for example, that don't want to appear pushy or intrusive. But I disagree. I don't think this is generational at all. I think that all sellers of all ages, in all sectors, selling all different kinds of products, I think we have all experienced this thought at one time or another that we don't want to come across as being pushy. Now, sometimes, of course, sometimes that's specific to certain prospects or certain groups of prospects. We tend to be a little more intimidated, or we put a little bit more of our own projected feelings onto certain types of prospects. But usually, whatever it is, whether it's refined to a couple of prospects or some groups of prospects, it is, by and large, not the reality. It's more of a mental perception that's fueling this. So, it begs the question, then why is it that sellers have call reluctance? So I've noticed it's these things in particular. Sellers tend to be more reluctant. They tend to use those phrases like, I don't want to come across as being pushy, more often when they're experiencing a dip in confidence, they're experiencing a time when their sales have been low, or they've gotten a lot of no's, or something is causing them to question the need for them to be making these calls, or the reception that they're getting from the people that they're calling on. Their confidence is low, and they have more call reluctance. They tend to feel more like they're being pushy at those times. What goes along with that, hand in hand, is that they've forgotten themselves, the sellers, have forgotten about their ability to add or create value for the people that they're calling on. Because that, to me, is what wipes this out. If we really feel like we bring value with every single contact we have with a prospect, that wipes out the feeling of being pushy. It takes away the bad feelings and the reluctances, the hesitations that we might have. And it's not that these are real, right? Confidence is not a real thing. It's a feeling. And we can't change our feelings unless we change the real things that cause them. So value perception, again, maybe not a real thing, but if we can get that to be more tangible, to show why and how that value is created or added in every single phone call, then we can begin to chip away at these mental blocks. Now, there are a couple of other things that fuel this feeling of being too pushy as a salesperson. Sometimes the seller is performing at a low level, and that may have eroded their confidence, but it also causes them to start getting under the microscope. A sales manager, others, the seller himself or herself, is beginning to feel that there's some need to externalize the blame, to make sure that it's not about what he or she is doing as a seller. So they begin to think, and they really believe this, they begin to think that the reason they're not making sales is because they are offending buyers in some way, or that what they're being asked to do because of their call metrics or because of what's being measured, what they're being asked to do is too much. And so they push back against those. Again, this is self-defeating. Right? Those call metrics, don't forget, they exist for a reason. Those are the best practices, the things that are proven to be effective. We can't make the leap to put this off on the buyers because buyers tell us something very different. Buyers don't think you're pushy nearly as often, and certainly not as soon as you think you're being pushy. So these two things don't match up. Be careful if you're externalizing that blame. I'll talk more in a moment about the evidence that suggests otherwise. Here's another one, though, that I do think bears mentioning. And if there's any piece of this that might be more true of people who are newer to the profession, it's this. When sellers are not as fully committed to the profession of selling, when they aren't seeing themselves as making it their entire career, they tend to more frequently disassociate themselves from it. And one of the things that happens is that they paint a picture of all sellers inherently being pushy and obnoxious. And when they put that categorization out there, of course they don't want to be that thing. They don't want to be thought of in that way. So it continues to take away from their ability to commit to selling as a career or profession. That's why it becomes such a big stumbling block. Well, since it's not provable that sellers are being pushy, in fact, before we ever get to buyer research about that, let's just talk about seller research. Where I start when I hear a seller say, I don't want to seem like I'm being pushy, I ask them to describe what it looks like to be pushy. I ask them to think about their own experiences as a buyer and what to them seems like pushy behavior. I ask them for metrics, right? Prove to me that a buyer is going to reach a tipping point and see you as pushy. What evidence or metric can you put behind that? How many calls is it? And sellers with these kinds of questions begin to realize that it's not provable that they're being pushy. Their own descriptions of being pushy are often a far cry from what they have done up to this point. So it helps us to discern when we ask those kinds of questions, even of ourselves. It helps us to discern the difference between what we're feeling and what buyers are actually experiencing, and that's a very important distinction. But we ought to take a look a little bit more at the symptoms, right? How can we even tell if we ourselves or sellers who are around us need to be having those kinds of conversations? The most obvious symptom is that the seller simply says it, and many do. They just say, I haven't called back yet because I don't want to seem pushy. That's one thing to look for. Another clear indication that there could be some call reluctance is that the seller is over-preparing for every call. That's actually just a form of procrastination. Spending too much time researching a prospect before calling a prospect is not generally going to be useful, right? You're overdoing it. There's a certain point at which you have enough information to make the initial cold call or to follow up with the prospect, and overdoing it with each and every one of them is a bad investment of your time. It's not worth it. So you've got to set some parameters around that. But if you see a seller consistently over-preparing, it's probably call reluctance. The same is true for sellers who disqualify leads too readily. Oh, no, he really sounded very busy. I don't want to call him back. That's an assumption. That's not valid. And even if you were correct in what you're sensing, that person is very busy, that's a temporary condition. And not only that, maybe it's that very busyness that signals a need for whatever you could offer to him or her. So be careful not to be reluctant based on things that are not supposed to be and really should not be knockout factors. A generalized discomfort with follow-up. If your top of the funnel is very strong but nothing seems to be advancing or too few things seem to be advancing through the sales process, if you're feeling badly or the people who work for you are tending to wish to call themselves something other than salespeople or tending to shy away from the parts of their sales job description that are about getting on the phone with or getting in front of customers and talking to them and selling to them and presenting urgently to them to advance to a close, any of that disassociation is a warning sign. It's also a warning sign if a seller is a little too eager to accept a continuance. Here's what I mean by that. The seller says, yeah, go ahead and send over some information. Don't ever celebrate that. That's not a victory. That's a continuance. What you need to be doing in those moments is recognizing that that's the same opportunity to set the next appointment, to continue advancing the sale as opposed to being happy with whatever gets you off the phone. If you'd like to learn more about these kinds of ideas related to cold calling, or if you would like to dial in a little deeper to what I'm describing here, take a look at another Bright Talk. It's right here on this channel, and it's about cold calling. It's called 20 cold calling tips in 20 minutes, and they come at you pretty rapid fire, but we'll go deeper into these sorts of issues that you might be experiencing. But everything here on screen, these are all symptoms of call reluctance. Maybe you've never seen it that way. In fact, sometimes when sales managers come to me, they say, yeah, we have a great funnel, but we're not closing enough sales. We need some training on how to close sales. But some additional diagnosis uncovers the fact that actually the problem isn't closing sales. We've got a problem that comes sooner, and it's about this call reluctance to follow up and advance the sale toward the close. So it's important to make that distinction. Here's another distinction that's very important to make, and this is one that sellers need to understand for themselves. Presenting urgency is not the same thing as being pushy. Getting back to a client because there is some urgency, some immediate need for them to take action in order to solve their problem, that's not at all the same as being pushy. We don't think of retailers as being pushy when they put time limits on their Black Friday sales or their clearance sales. And we don't consider it to be pushy when tickets to an anticipated event go on sale and will very quickly sell out. We don't think of doctors in the emergency room. We don't think of them as being pushy when they recommend an immediate X-ray or an MRI or a CAT scan to pinpoint and diagnose a problem. And sales is no different. There is urgency when it comes to selling. There should be urgency when it comes to the way you interact with your prospects and your customers. You are, just like the doctor in the ER, you are there to diagnose a problem. You can't do it if you aren't taking some next steps and prescribing some deeper introspection. Instead of an X-ray, you're asking for an appointment to set up a needs assessment. Instead of taking it to the next step to give the options for surgery, you're asking for the demo. Instead of being the event venue that's got the tickets on sale, you are the seller who's going to offer some other solution that will be equally gratifying, satisfying, positive, but it can't happen unless you've got some urgency around that. And that isn't pushy. Pushy is a whole nother thing. Pushy is a stretch beyond doing the things, taking the steps that would get the buyer where they want to be. So I'd like you to make that distinction and to think about that when you're hearing those words creep into your mind or coming out of your mouth. Am I really being pushy? The chances are probably not. And when you hear that from a seller or when you say that yourself, I strongly encourage you to confront this directly. Intervention is required here. You've got to call it out and you've got to address this directly. What you need to do is put a stop to the perception because it's not accurate and it's not serving you well in sales. And it needs to be handled directly, but also with sensitivity. Because please remember, and I'm talking to you if you experience this, but if you're a sales manager and you hope to confront this with someone, please be keeping this in mind. We're actually talking about an issue of identity here. A salesperson who's having a bit of a crisis of conscience, and they're asking, am I being obnoxious, overbearing, unlikable? Am I becoming that stereotypical snake oil used car salesman, all those ugly stereotypes that I don't want to be? That's not who I am. So we're not asking anyone to have a personality transplant when we ask them to think with urgency and to respond urgently to their buyers. We're asking them to be respectful and to build rapport and trust. And urgency is one of the ways that you do that when you do it appropriately. And appropriately is, in fact, to call back with regularity so that you break through and are able to set up a time with that prospect. And urgency is absolutely appropriate when you've already broken through with a prospect and you owe some sort of follow-up to them to help them solve their problem. There are very specific ways that you can work on this. So I want to shift now to some solutions of our own And they come in different places throughout a sales career. So if you are hiring salespeople into your organization, don't set yourself up to fail by hiring people who are already mired in this mindset. During the interview process, watch for some code words. Those code words are actually going to sound pretty good because people are going to talk about themselves as consultative sellers. They're going to talk about the level of service they provide their customers. They'll describe the relationships that they build. And yes, these are all really good things, and they're highly valued in selling. But they must be balanced, and you need to see a balance in the interviewing process. You want to balance to see that there's also a sense of urgency and a strong desire on the part of the sales candidate to advance the sale. And you can also build this into your hiring process. Is this a candidate who is urgently following up with you, trying to help you to see that they are presenting with urgency, and also showing you that they have persistence to get the job, the same kind of persistence they would be relying on to help your buyers solve their problems? Past behaviors are the best indicator of future behaviors. So in the hiring process, you want to look for the way the candidate conducts himself or herself, and also ask questions about their past behaviors when it comes to the cadence. Typically, you might ask, how long do you wait between follow-up calls when you are prospecting? And ask them to give you specific examples so you can ascertain what they really do. Not only that, don't ask just about the cadence and about their sales habits so that you can glean their past behaviors around urgency and around potential call reluctance, but ask them their perceptions about selling. Tell me about your sales career. Tell me about your future in sales. And what you're looking for is to see if there's a sense of pride and ownership, that they feel good about being a salesperson, because not feeling good about any aspect of sales is probably not going to serve you well if you hire that person into a sales job. And if you are a salesperson and what I'm describing is true for you, I would encourage you to think twice about your career. If you cannot reconcile the nobility of this profession and the power you have to make positive change for your buyers, you might want to re-examine what you're doing in this field. Back to the interview process, though, something you can also do is ask about this directly. Just ask the question, how do you know when you've gone too far and you look like a stereotypical pushy seller? You'll get an idea. You'll be able to gauge from the candidate how reasonable they are in their own assessment of what it means to be pushy. If they tell you that, oh no, I would never be a pushy seller, I only make 1 or 2 phone calls because I know that any more than that is disrespectful, you know that's not reality. In fact, the average number of calls that it takes to break through to a prospect, calls, emails, voicemails, messages with gatekeepers, all of the above, it actually takes an average of 17.2 to make it through to a needs assessment. So if someone tells you that they feel pushy after 3 or 4, well, that's something that's not accurate, and you're going to have a perception issue to overcome from day one if you hire that individual. So be ready for that. Now that you've got the right folks, though, they're coming in the door, the ones who are less likely to have this wrong perception about being pushy, you want to be sure to offer training to your new hires, but on an ongoing basis too. That budget that you're putting into enablement tools and sales scripts, they have value, but please know that they alone will not build confidence. In fact, they could have the opposite effect. They may cause your sellers to feel like they're being more pushy, because those enablement tools will pop up something that says it's time to call this person back, and if that cadence doesn't match the perception of the seller, they'll reject it, and your enablement tool will be a bad investment because no one's using it. Or if you've got scripts, proven, reliable, valid scripts that really work, but you haven't trained people so they feel confident in using them, They might also reject those. They will cause people to feel like they're going to be just another salesperson doing this thing that other stereotypical sellers do, and that gets lumped in with being pushy. So caution, as you bring in wonderful tools, be sure you offer the kind of training that will give people confidence in those tools so they won't reject them out of the notion of not wanting to feel pushy. When you do your training, be sure to include role play. Sure, nobody likes it. That's a fact. But role play, working it out in the training classroom or one-on-one in your office as you're offering some sales coaching, when they are working out what to say and how to say it to build urgency, they're less likely to see it as being pushy because they themselves have become more comfortable with what they need to do. And last but not least, be sure to offer solid training around your value proposition and on how to make that a unique value proposition for the clients and prospects that your sellers will be talking to. Don't do product training alone without making sure that front and center you have your value proposition, because remember, as I said earlier, the number one way to break through call reluctance is to understand the value that you're about to be able to bring, the difference you're going to be able to make for this particular buyer. If you'd like a little bit more help with training, there are some great resources. I attached a couple of them for you here, and if you're new to Bright Talk, perhaps you haven't seen the attachments feature before, but there are links and downloads that I've included for you that are relevant to this topic. The first one that you'll see there is that I've given you a tool, some questions that can be used to break through the discomfort in that initial cold call. And these are proven, field-tested questions that sellers have used multiple times, and they engage and show high value for a buyer right away. I also attached for you a flyer that describes something new that will be coming here to Bright Talk. It's the Sales Experts channel, and there are going to be 64 sales experts conducting training all throughout the year. It's all free, and it's easy to access on demand or live. So use these kinds of tools if you need some help with training, because training is one way to get confident. Confidence is one way to break through call reluctance and to not let that be a vicious cycle. Here's another tool as a manager that you can use. And this is, of course, going to be specific to your business, so pick and choose. But activity metrics that are measured and the expectations that go along with them, hopefully backed up by some coaching from you as a sales manager to show the value of why these metrics are in place, these will enable you to get your sellers back on track. If they are feeling like they're being too pushy or they're experiencing call reluctance and they're procrastinating, these metrics can help move them back in the right direction. Number of calls made. It's a metric that is often debated. You would never want it to become the overriding metric because I firmly believe quality matters more than quantity. But if you have no quantity standard, no minimum number of cold calls or prospecting calls required, then you are giving license to this notion that calls shouldn't be made. You're allowing call reluctance to take hold if you don't have no metric at all in place. So consider the possibility that sometimes people do need prompting, and if they aren't making calls, they're going to continue to get mired in that belief that making calls somehow makes them a pushy seller. Many organizations use a time-to-dial type metric. In other words, a time that starts the day within 30 minutes of coming into the office. So if the start time is 8:30, by 9 o'clock, everyone is on the phone and making those calls. The value of this is that it diminishes the likelihood that people will find other busy work. They won't be over-researching their prospects. They won't be doing other non-selling activities if there's a start time to get things moving in the right direction at the start of the day. Some organizations take this a step further, and there is a limited amount of prep time that you're supposed to do before you make your initial call. That's not a half-bad idea. to coach your salespeople and say, I think within 2 minutes you should be able to get all the information you need to start the conversation. Think about also the cadence between contacts. How long is it appropriate to wait between contacts? If I emailed today, should I leave a voicemail tomorrow? If it's too uncertain, if it's completely up to me, I might not be able to actually use the right judgment. I might let my reservations or my reluctance supersede what you already probably know is the appropriate cadence, the one that has been most effective for your sellers historically. So go ahead, especially for your new sellers. Set this up. Set your expectation. Maybe it's a series of 17 connections. We email at the same time that we email, we also send this piece of content. And on day 2, we leave a voicemail followed up immediately by another email. Do some research, figure out what that cadence should be, do some A/B testing, and figure it out so that people have that guidance. That guidance will take out of the equation their own interpretation of what it looks like to be pushy. And then measure how often they got to know versus getting a continuance. This is actually a positive metric. Getting a no, it's not as good as getting a yes, certainly, but it's far better than getting a continuance where we really are in limbo. So being pushy enough to get to the place where we know it's either a green light or a red light is important. We don't want yellow lights across our entire funnel because every one of our leads being a continuance doesn't serve anyone well. It's also a good idea, as you're putting these activity metrics into place, to explain that they are there intentionally to create urgency for your sellers. Help them to understand the value of striking while the iron's hot and following up with buyers quickly. Because after they've made the first connection with a buyer, that's when the buyer is most interested. That's when the buyer is most likely to have time and attention spent on follow-up information. So proceeding quickly with urgency doesn't make you pushy. In fact, it makes you more effective. Now, we ask buyers about that very thing. What is it that causes you to negatively view a salesperson, positively view a salesperson? And one of the biggest things that causes a negative perception of a salesperson is that they don't do what they say they will do. A seller instantly loses credibility when they say, I will send you the information, but then the seller doesn't send the information in a timely manner. A seller who fails to follow up in the way they promised to the buyer is a seller who's often saying, I'll do it, I just don't want to seem pushy. I know they're very busy. I'll get it to them within a couple of days. The seller thinks they're doing something positive. The buyer thinks just the opposite and has a negative reaction, and that becomes a barrier. It's a broken trust. It's a lost credibility, and it's a huge disconnect. So sellers, please hear me when I say your buyers actually want you to follow up sooner than later. They will be gauging your responsiveness in a way that you might not even conceive that they are, but they are gauging your trustworthiness, your credibility, and determining whether or not you are someone they're going to proceed with based on how quickly and how responsive you are to whatever you've promised. A few other things that you can do to help sellers who are experiencing call reluctance or saying they don't want to seem pushy. Here are some of the coaching questions that I ask that I think tend to open up the conversation and transform the way the seller is looking at the situation. By the way, if you want to know more about sales coaching in general, there's also another webinar here on Bright Talk right within the same channel that's all about being a sales coach. So that might be something that you choose to listen to later. But for this specific situation, you might ask coaching questions like this. The seller says, I don't want to seem pushy. Depending on what else you know to be true about the seller, maybe you ask them what I suggested earlier, what do you mean by pushy? Describe for me what pushy looks like. When you are in the buyer seat, what do you see a seller doing that causes you to think of them as pushy? So maybe it's that initial reframing of what pushy even means. Or maybe this could be a problem where the seller thinks or has forgotten that they bring value. They think they don't bring value with time spent with him or her, the seller, or they think that the product isn't going to bring value, or they don't believe the buyer is at a place where they could understand the value. All of those are probably not accurate. A seller who's doing a good job always brings value to a buyer. The conversation alone is of value. A product that makes a difference to a buyer inherently brings value. Great conversations about changes that need to be made are huge value. That's created value for the buyer. So understanding the perception the seller has about the value they do or don't bring is a great coaching conversation to have. So you might just tee it up with a simple yes-no question. Do you believe that you can genuinely bring value to our clients? It's important to know, and that'll bring about a whole much longer conversation if the answer is no, but work it out with your seller. Maybe you want to find out what it is that the seller needs to be more confident. Is there a certain piece of research? Is there a pep talk they need? Is there some testimonials that would be useful to them? What would cause them to feel more confident about calling on prospects? Sellers, if you don't know that answer for yourself, think about the times when you have been successful. What made you confident? What was going on with that prospect? And set yourself up to be confident and successful by making sure that's what you've got with each and every one of the calls you make. And then finally, remind your sellers when they're experiencing that erosion of confidence, that the mojo is not there, remind them of the times when they followed up, and because they followed up, they did something positive for a prospect. Not only did they make a sale, but there was a positive impact on the buyer. What would have happened if they had been in this particular funk at that time? What would have happened if they were afraid of being pushy and that buyer never got the benefit of what they had to offer? So these are just some examples of some thought starter questions that you can use as a coach to help your seller see things differently. Last but not least is, in terms of what you can do, is practice. Practice. As a seller, practice just to break through your mental block. Give yourself permission to make 10 bad calls. It's okay. Make 10 bad calls, and as you're making those 10 bad calls, the only purpose of them is to shake off the feeling that you have, your call reluctance, so that you can make better calls later. You've just got to break through the mental barrier. Managers, do role play with your sellers one-on-one, intensively, and often do role playing with them so that they can begin to remember the value that they bring to buyers, and so that they can see that there's a long way between what they're doing now and really being obnoxious. Pushy is a long ways away from where they probably are right now. Another way to practice, a softer way, is to play back your own calls. Listen to your own calls. Identify what's working and what doesn't work. Be sure, if you're coaching someone else, to point out those customer reactions. There are a lot of customer reactions, and they've got nothing to do with the salesperson who's being pushy. There are many other reasons that people are reacting, and, by the way, many other ways that they're saying, please talk to me later, instead of saying, no, I'm not interested. Big differences there. You can listen to others' calls, too. If you've never discovered the call camp that Steve Richards runs, I put a link in the attachments for you. It's fantastic. Listen to the calls that other salespeople are making, and you'll soon notice that they don't seem pushy at all. In fact, maybe they seem helpful. That's how buyers are perceiving them. And during those call camp recorded calls, you're hearing some sales coaching, and you can learn from that. So it's a great way just to re-energize yourself and to get some great tips along the way. Additional tips, just some bonus material here. It helps if you end each day by thinking about what you're going to do tomorrow. Identify at the end of today a couple of follow-up calls that you want to make tomorrow so that you're not relying on the emotion, the mood, the fire that has to be put out tomorrow. Don't let those things direct what you do tomorrow. Instead, have your to-do list, a short one of calls that you need to make tomorrow morning. And as you're doing that, you also won't get sucked into whatever's happening on social media and the emails and all the other stuff that comes up that probably takes a lot of minutes out of the beginning of your days right now. So refocus yourself, make your plan at the end of the day. If you are fearful, hesitant about the actions that you would take to make calls, I would like to ask you to think about what's the worst that could happen. What's the worst thing that could happen if you make this call? And even the worst thing that could happen if accidentally you are a little bit pushy. And balance that out. What's the best thing that could happen if you make that call? Keep those two things proportionate, but then do something else. Balance the scale by also saying, what's the best thing that could happen if I don't make that call? By the way, that answer is probably nothing's going to happen, but ask it anyway. And then ask yourself, what's the worst thing that could happen if I don't make that call? When you put those two things together, the worst thing that could happen is you're probably going to lose the customer. The prospect is going to go somewhere else to do business. The best thing that could happen if you do make the call, even if you are a little pushy, is that you could get a new customer. You could actually help someone who needs help today, help that you can bring to them. So balance it out. Remind yourself that you have something of value to offer. How about giving yourself a little reward? The more cold calls you make, the more follow-ups you do, the faster your follow-up. Build in some incentives for yourself. Don't rely on your company to do all the incentivizing for you. And then remember that we all experience these things. We all have these feelings in sales. We all have tasks we'd rather not do. Brian Tracy calls that eating the frog. At the beginning of the day, eat the frog, and then the rest of your day, it's no longer on your mind. You can go on to other things, and you will have already tackled the hardest part of your day. If it's call reluctance, making cold calls, following up with prospects that is the hardest, then do that first. Get it out of the way. Now, if you need any help with this inside your organization, I hope that you'll be in touch with me. I'm Deb Calvert. The company is People First Productivity Solutions, and we'd love to help you get some additional tools and some additional thoughts. I don't have all the answers, but I am pretty well resourced. I included a book recommendation for you there in the attachments because I think it's a very, very good book that deals exactly with this subject. We also provide training. We have the Advance the Sale training program that will help you cut out continuances, put an end to pending, and stop stalling out in sales. We offer one-to-one sales coaching, executive coaching, manager coaching. Whatever your needs might be, we genuinely like to help. So give me a call, send me an email. I won't initially try to sell you anything. I might later on if I think I have an ability to help you. But I do a lot of coaching just because it's also an opportunity for me to conduct research. So take me up on it. Every webinar, one or two people do, so you shouldn't feel guilty about it. I would genuinely like to hear from you if you've attended this presentation, and I hope that you'll connect with me at a minimum on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever your preference may be. Hey, thanks for attending this Bright Talk, and go out and challenge yourself. You are not a pushy seller. You are a seller who has something of value to offer to your clients. So work through those feelings and push yourself so that you can really offer what you have.